The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, a restless energy rippling through the spectators. It was the kind of case that normally wouldn't make headlines. Just another black teenager in trouble, just another routine conviction. At least, that's what Judge Henry Calloway thought as he leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly against the polished wood of his desk. He didn't need to look at the defendant to know how this would go. It was always the same. Malik Carter, 18 years old, charged with burglary and resisting arrest. Judge Calloway had seen it all before. A young man standing before him, head down, pretending to be innocent. He skimmed the file, already certain of the outcome. A witness identification, some fingerprints at the scene, and a hoodie that matched the security footage. "Mr. Carter," he sighed, rubbing his temple, "I assume you're ready to enter a guilty plea and save us all some time." He didn't expect what happened next. Malik lifted his chin. "No, Your Honor." For the first time, Judge Calloway actually looked at the defendant. The boy standing before him wasn't fidgeting, wasn't looking at the floor, wasn't breaking into nervous apologies or asking for mercy. Malik Carter stood there, completely still, his eyes locked onto the judge's, and he wasn't afraid. Judge Calloway frowned. That was new. The prosecutor, Lisa Monroe, cleared her throat, stepping forward in her crisp suit, her confidence evident. "Your Honor, we have overwhelming evidence." Malik cut her off. "I'll be representing myself." The room exploded. Laughter, whispers, muffled gasps, a courtroom full of people shaking their heads in disbelief. Judge Calloway chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, this is rich." Even the bailiff smirked. "You think you're some kind of prodigy, son?" Malik's voice was calm. "I think I know enough." A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Calloway wasn't laughing anymore. Lisa Monroe adjusted her papers, irritation flickering across her face. "This isn't a high school debate, Mr. Carter. If you lose, you're looking at 10 years behind bars." Malik didn't flinch. "Then I guess I better win." Silence. Judge Calloway folded his hands, studying him for a long moment. "Fine, let's hear the prosecution." Lisa Monroe stood tall, smoothing down her blazer, slipping effortlessly into her well-rehearsed opening statement. "Your Honor, the defendant was identified by a store clerk. His hoodie matches the one seen in the security footage. His fingerprints were found at the scene of the crime. This is an open and shut case." She turned to the jury, delivering her final blow. "The evidence speaks for itself." The jury nodded. The spectators murmured. It all sounded convincing. But Malik? He tilted his head slightly and smiled. "You sure about that?" Lisa Monroe narrowed her eyes. Malik stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the lead detective." Judge Calloway sighed. "Fine, this should be good." Officer Bradley, the arresting officer, took the stand, sitting up straight in his uniform. He had done this 100 times before. He was ready. Malik folded his hands behind his back, his voice smooth and steady. "You stated my fingerprints were found at the scene." Bradley nodded. "That's right." "Can you confirm where exactly?" Bradley cleared his throat. "The counter, near the cash register." Malik nodded slowly. "Near, not on." A small shift in the courtroom. The jury leaned in. Malik kept his gaze locked on the officer. "Did you test every fingerprint found on the counter?" Bradley hesitated. Lisa Monroe's jaw tightened. Malik tilted his head. "Or did you only test mine?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Calloway leaned forward. Officer Bradley shifted in his seat. "We tested the ones we deemed relevant to the case." Malik's lips curled into a smirk. "So, just mine." No answer. The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. Lisa Monroe interjected, her voice sharp. "The fact remains, Mr. Carter, your hoodie matches the one in the security footage." Malik turned to her. "Play the footage." She hesitated. "Go on," Malik said, crossing his arms. "Let's see it." The judge waved his hand. The bailiff pressed play. A figure in a hoodie entered the store. Malik pointed. Pause it. The hooded figure's face is never visible. Resume. The figure moves to the register. The clerk never once looks up. Malik turned back to Monroe. How does a man who never looked up identify me? Lisa Monroe opened her mouth. Malik cut her off. You had 2 weeks to make your case, Miss Monroe. I just tore it apart in 2 minutes. The jury exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered under their breath. Judge Calloway rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing. Lisa Monroe gritted her teeth. We still have the officer's statement. Malik raised a hand. You mean the one where he said I ran from the police? Bradley shifted again. Malik's smile grew wider. Funny, because if you check his body cam transcript, you'll see I never ran. The tension snapped like a rubber band. Judge Calloway stiffened. What? Malik held up a printed transcript. Your Honor, this is the body cam transcript from Officer Bradley's report. It says, and I quote, suspect continued walking, did not respond to verbal command, officers engaged. Judge Calloway's eyes narrowed. Lisa Monroe's face paled. Malik turned back to the jury. I wasn't running, I was walking, until I got tackled. A murmur ran through the spectators. Malik didn't let up. And before they even asked my name, they had already called in my arrest. Lisa Monroe looked down at her papers, scrambling. Malik took a slow step forward. The truth is, Your Honor, the prosecution isn't presenting a case. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. They're presenting a story. Silence. Judge Calloway's jaw tightened. Lisa Monroe looked like she wanted to disappear. And Malik, he was just getting started. The silence in the courtroom was thick, the weight of Malik's words hanging in the air. He had just dismantled the prosecution's case in minutes, and everyone knew it. The spectators, the jury, even Judge Calloway, who had started the day with an amused smirk, now looked slightly uneasy. Lisa Monroe, the prosecutor, quickly recovered, smoothing her blazer and stepping forward. She wasn't about to let a teenager embarrass her in open court. The fact remains, she said, voice sharp, that the store clerk identified you as the person in the store at the time of the burglary. Malik let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. He turned to the jury, locking eyes with them one by one. You know what's funny about that? He asked, his tone calm but cutting. I have a question for you all. He gestured toward the security footage, which was still paused on the screen. He stepped forward, closer to the jury. Have you ever walked into a store wearing a hoodie? The jurors exchanged glances, a few nodding hesitantly. Malik continued, and when you did you automatically become a criminal? The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Calloway cleared his throat. Watch your tone, Mr. Carter. Malik didn't flinch. I apologize, Your Honor. Let me rephrase. He turned back to Lisa Monroe. You're telling me that because someone in a hoodie was seen in that store and I happen to own a hoodie, that's enough to convict me? Lisa folded her arms. The store clerk identified you. Malik nodded. Right, the store clerk. The same man who, in his first statement to police, said he wasn't sure who he saw. But then, 2 days later, after being questioned again, suddenly remembered it was me. Lisa's jaw tightened. Memory can become clearer over time. Malik smirked. Or sometimes people are just pressured into saying what the police want to hear. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Calloway slammed his gavel. Watch yourself, Mr. Carter. Malik raised his hands. I'm just saying, Your Honor, that memory is a funny thing. And if we're going to send someone to prison based on it, shouldn't we at least make sure it's reliable? He turned back to Lisa. That's why I'd like to call the store clerk to the stand. Lisa blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Malik smiled. The witness, the man who apparently remembers so clearly. I'd love to ask him a few questions. Judge Calloway hesitated. He could shut this down, but doing so would look suspicious. He exhaled. Bailiff, bring in the witness. A few moments later, the store clerk, a wiry man in his late 50s named Ernest Wilkins, was escorted to the stand. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Malik stepped forward. "Mr. Wilkins, thank you for being here today." Ernest nodded, avoiding eye contact. Malik grabbed a sheet of paper. "This is your original statement, correct? The one where you told police you weren't sure about the suspect's identity?" Ernest's throat bobbed. Well, yeah, at first." Malik nodded. "Right, but 2 days later, after a second interview with the police, you suddenly remembered?" Ernest scratched the back of his head. I just thought about it more." Malik tilted his head. "Or were you told to think about it more?" Lisa Monroe stood abruptly. "Objection!" Judge Calloway sighed. "Sustained." Malik shrugged. "Fine. Let me ask a different question." He walked a little closer. "Mr. Wilkins, when you saw the person in the hoodie, where were you standing?" Ernest blinked. Behind the counter." Malik nodded. "And where was the suspect?" "In front of the counter." Malik's lips twitched. "So, just to clarify, you were standing behind the counter, the suspect was standing in front of the counter, and you never saw their face clearly." Ernest shifted in his seat. I mean, not at first, but—" Malik held up a hand. "That's all I needed to hear." Lisa Monroe's face hardened. "The jury can decide how reliable his testimony is." Malik turned to the jury. "That's exactly my point." The jury members shifted uncomfortably. Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose. "Move on." Malik wasn't finished. He glanced at Lisa. "You said my fingerprints were found at the scene, correct?" Lisa nodded. "Correct." Malik nodded too. "Okay, and how many other fingerprints were found?" Lisa opened her mouth, then hesitated. Malik smiled. "Let me answer that for you. Dozens. The store is open to the public. The counter, the door handle, the cash register. Hundreds of people touch them every day." Lisa looked irritated. "Your fingerprints were specifically on the counter where the burglary occurred." Malik shrugged. "And I've been to that store before. I've bought chips, gum, a soda. You telling me it's a crime to touch the counter when you're buying something?" The jury was completely silent now. Lisa Monroe flipped through her notes, but it was clear she was scrambling. Malik took a slow step forward, keeping his voice calm but firm. "This case isn't about fingerprints. It isn't about a security video. It isn't even about the store clerk's memory." He paused. "It's about assumption." Lisa Monroe bristled. "That's ridiculous." Malik turned to the jury. "They assumed I was guilty before they even looked at the evidence. They assumed I was the suspect because I fit the description. They assumed a black kid in a hoodie must have been up to no good." Silence. Malik let the moment stretch. Then he exhaled. "But assumptions don't make someone guilty." He turned back to Lisa. "That's why I have one final question." Lisa folded her arms. "Go ahead." Malik held up a paper. "Is it true that the forensic expert who analyzed my fingerprints was not called to testify today?" Lisa's jaw clenched. Malik smirked. "So let me get this straight. You're using fingerprint evidence to try and convict me, but the person who actually analyzed the fingerprints isn't even here to explain how the process works?" Lisa's face reddened. "The evidence speaks for itself." Malik tilted his head. "Does it? Or are you just hoping nobody questions it?" Judge Calloway looked over at Lisa, waiting. Lisa let out a sharp breath. "The prosecution has nothing further at this time." A quiet shockwave rolled through the courtroom. The jury was watching Malik now, really watching him, because in the span of 10 minutes he had made them question everything they thought they knew. And for the first time since the trial began, Judge Calloway was watching him too, not with amusement, not with arrogance, but with something closer to concern. Because for the first time, Calloway realized this case wasn't going the way he thought it would. Judge Calloway sighed, rubbing his temple. He had walked into this courtroom expecting a simple case, A young defendant, a clear-cut charge, and an easy conviction. That was how these cases usually went. The system worked quickly when it wanted to. But this was something else entirely. Malik Carter stood before him, not as a desperate kid begging for leniency, but as someone who knew the law better than the people trying to prosecute him. And the worst part? He was winning. Lisa Monroe, the prosecutor, was clearly rattled, flipping through her notes with stiff fingers, searching for something, anything, to regain control of the case. But Malik was already 2 steps ahead. He turned back to the jury, his voice calm, his posture relaxed. "I want you to think about something," he said. "We've talked about the fingerprints. We've talked about the witness who couldn't see my face. We've talked about the security footage that never actually identified me." He took a step closer. "But we haven't talked about why I was stopped in the first place." Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses. "You were fleeing the scene." Malik smirked. "That's what the police report says, doesn't it?" He turned to Lisa Monroe. "Do you mind reading exactly what the arresting officer wrote?" Lisa's jaw tightened. Malik raised an eyebrow. "Would you like me to read it for you?" Lisa exhaled sharply and lifted the report. The suspect was spotted near the crime scene and attempted to flee when approached by law enforcement. Malik nodded. "Right, but here's the thing." He turned back to the jury. "I didn't run." Another murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Calloway frowned. "The report says you did." Malik held up a new sheet of paper. "This is the body cam transcript, directly from the officer's footage." Lisa's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't seen this. Malik cleared his throat and read aloud. "Suspect observed walking near the scene. Officers exited vehicle and gave verbal command. Suspect did not respond. Officers engaged." He lowered the paper, looking straight at Judge Calloway. "There's no mention of running." Lisa Monroe quickly spoke up. "The officers believed—" Malik held up a hand. "They believed. But that's not what the footage shows. The report was written after the fact, and yet it conveniently makes me look more guilty than the actual video does." The jury shifted in their seats. Malik turned back to the judge. "So, let me ask you something, Your Honor. If I had been white, wearing a polo shirt instead of a hoodie, just walking home that night, do you think the officers would have tackled me without asking any questions?" Calloway's fingers tightened around his gavel. Lisa Monroe scoffed. "Objection, that's speculation." Malik didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the judge. "Is it?" he asked. The judge exhaled slowly. "Move on." Malik smiled slightly. He already had his answer. Lisa Monroe was scrambling now. "The fact remains," she said quickly. "The defendant's fingerprints were at the scene, and the jury can decide whether or not—" Malik interrupted her. "Let's talk about those fingerprints, actually." Lisa froze. Malik took another step forward. "You see, the prosecution keeps throwing around the phrase, 'fingerprints were found at the scene,' but they never explained how those prints were analyzed." Lisa crossed her arms. "Fingerprints are standard forensic evidence. Everyone knows how it works." Malik smiled. "Do they? Or do we just assume we know?" Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. Malik lifted a second document. "This is a request to subpoena the forensic analyst who processed my fingerprints." He let the paper dangle between his fingers. "But oddly enough, she's not here." Judge Calloway shifted in his chair. "Mr. Carter." Malik turned to the jury. "The prosecution is using forensic evidence to convict me, but they didn't bother bringing in the one person who could actually explain how the evidence was tested." He turned back to Lisa Monroe. "And I think I know why." Lisa's jaw tightened. Malik set the document down on the table, tapping it lightly. "Because if she was here, she might have to explain the chain of custody. She might have to explain that actually the fingerprints weren't found on the register, but near it. She might have to explain that fingerprint analysis isn't the perfect science TV shows make it out to be." A few jurors raised their eyebrows. Malik continued. "You see, the prosecution hopes you'll hear fingerprints and stop asking questions. But ask yourself, How many people touched that counter? How many people walk in and out of that store every day? How do we know those prints weren't from a week ago? Silence. Lisa Monroe's face was red. She didn't have an answer. Judge Calloway's expression had changed. He wasn't smirking anymore. Malik leaned on the table slightly. If this case was as strong as they claimed, why are there so many missing pieces? Lisa Monroe inhaled sharply. Your Honor, Judge Calloway held up a hand. He was looking at Malik now, really looking at him. For the first time, he didn't see a teenager in trouble. He saw a problem, and the problem was that Malik Carter was right. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the spectators who had been laughing at him earlier were hanging on his every word. Malik turned to the jury one last time. They want you to see a criminal, he said quietly. He exhaled. But all I see is doubt. And doubt. That was enough. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from boredom or waiting for the next argument, but a heavy, suffocating silence. The kind that only came when people were forced to think. Judge Calloway shifted in his seat. His fingers tapped against the bench, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had been on the bench for over 15 years. He had seen guilty men lie, innocent men panic, and lawyers bluff their way through weak arguments. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Lisa Monroe, the prosecutor, stood stiffly beside her desk, her face locked in an expression of barely controlled frustration. She had lost control of the case long ago, and now she was just waiting for it to end. Malik Carter, however, stood calmly. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't uncertain. He wasn't looking at the judge for approval or hoping the jury would take pity on him. He was in control. He had been in control from the moment he opened his mouth. Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose. He straightened in his chair. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice measured, "do you have any further arguments to present?" Lisa opened her mouth, closed it, then cleared her throat. "Your Honor, the state believes that the evidence speaks for itself." Malik tilted his head slightly. "Does it?" Lisa glared at him. The defendant's fingerprints were still found at the scene. Malik sighed, shaking his head. "The fingerprints that you still can't prove were left during the crime." Lisa's jaw clenched. "The witness still identified—" Malik raised a hand. "The witness who never actually saw the suspect's face?" Lisa swallowed hard. "The security footage," Malik turned to the jury, "which shows someone in a hoodie. Not me. Just a hoodie." Lisa's hands curled into fists. Judge Calloway looked at her. "Ms. Monroe." She inhaled sharply, then looked down. The fire in her expression was gone. She knew there was nothing left to say. "No further arguments, Your Honor," she muttered. A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Calloway tapped his fingers against his desk once more, his gaze lingering on Malik. "Young man," he said, "do you have anything else to say before I make my ruling?" Malik took a slow breath. Then he looked at the jury. "I just have one last thing," he said, his voice steady. "I want you to think about something." He took a step closer. "How many times has a case like this gone differently?" A few jurors stiffened. "How many times has someone been arrested just because they looked like they belonged in handcuffs?" The murmurs grew louder. "How many times has the system assumed guilt instead of proving it?" He let the silence settle. Then he looked at Judge Calloway. "And how many times has the judge just gone along with it?" The entire courtroom froze. Judge Calloway's fingers tightened around his gavel. His lips parted slightly as if he was going to speak, but he didn't, because he couldn't. The weight of the moment crushed down on him. Malik wasn't just talking about this case. He was talking about all of them, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. For a long time, Judge Calloway didn't say anything. He simply looked at Malik, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he leaned forward. He opened his mouth, and he spoke the words that would change everything. "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, the hum of disbelief and tension breaking all at once. The bailiff barked for order. The gavel slammed down. But the energy in the room couldn't be contained. Malik didn't move. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He had known from the moment he stepped into that courtroom that this would be the outcome. Not because he was lucky, not because the system worked, but because he refused to let it fail him. Judge Calloway took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes for a moment before looking at Malik again, and in his expression something had shifted. It wasn't amusement, it wasn't arrogance, it was realization, maybe even regret. Malik met his gaze. He didn't smirk, he didn't gloat, he just nodded. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom. The moment he stepped into the hallway, the noise exploded. Reporters, flashing lights, microphones shoved forward. "Malik, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Malik ignored them. He didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. This was about something bigger. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother stood waiting. Denise Carter, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't say anything at first. Then, finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Malik chuckled, scratched the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." Denise just stared at him for a second longer. Then she pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The reporters kept flashing their cameras, kept shouting questions, kept trying to turn this into a moment. But Malik wasn't paying attention to them anymore. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Calloway watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. For the first time, he actually looked like he was thinking about what just happened, thinking about how many cases before this had gone differently, thinking about how many people hadn't been able to do what Malik had just done, because Malik had done something most people never got the chance to do. He had made the system look at itself, and for once, the system blinked first. Malik pulled his hoodie over his head, shoving his hands back into his pockets as he started walking away. His mother walked beside him, their steps in sync. He knew what the reporters wanted. They wanted a sound bite. They wanted a speech. They wanted something that would look good in a headline. But Malik didn't care about headlines. He had something else in mind. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one.